Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everybody, to Teaching Democracy, Civic Friendship, and Civics in Literacy, K through 3. Thank you so much for joining us on the end of a workday on a beautiful afternoon. I hope that people are listening in from outdoors, or at least have a window open. So my name is Martha Madsen, and I am the executive director of New Hampshire Civics. And I'm so pleased to be hosting some incredible leaders in civics education from Michigan State University today. This webinar will offer 2 hours of professional development. And if you decide to fully participate, which means you try something out in your classroom that you learned here, write it up as a lesson with a reflection at the end, and then submit it to me by May 1st of next year, then you will receive 8 professional development hours and a $75 stipend. These lessons are edited, and many of them end up in our New Hampshire Civics curriculum library, which you can check out at nhcivics.org. All of those lessons come from New Hampshire teachers inspired by New Hampshire Civics learning opportunities. So they're locally sourced. And anyway, so we'd love to have more materials actually for K through 3. We're a little light on those in the library, so we'd love more. With that, I'd like to introduce you today to today's presenters and leaders. We're fortunate to have Maggie Demarse with us today. She's a PhD student at Michigan State University, and her research focuses on interdisciplinary project-based learning in elementary science and social studies. She teaches undergraduate courses in social studies methods. And before her studies at Michigan State, she was an elementary and middle school teacher in Dayton, Ohio. Also with us today is Anne-Lise Halvorsen, who is Associate Professor of Teacher Education at Michigan State. Her scholarship focuses on the history of education, social studies teaching and learning, and the integration of social studies with other subjects. Her current work focuses on the history of elementary social studies education, project-based learning, and historical thinking. She is co-author of Reasoning with Democratic Values, Ethical Issues in American History. And also joining us from Michigan State is Dr. Jane Lowe. She's Assistant Professor of Teacher Education, and her research focuses on youth political engagement, social studies curriculum development, and equity in civics education. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in social studies methods. And prior to her work as professor, Dr. Lowe was a teacher of government, economics, and Chinese in Austin, Texas. In addition, Anne-Lise Halvorsen also taught kindergarten. So we have 3 presenters who've really been there. They've been in the classroom. They understand, at least pre-pandemic, what it was like to teach. So with that, I thank our presenters, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. We're just delighted that you're here. We heard it's a beautiful day in New Hampshire. It's not so beautiful in Michigan, so that's where we are. So we really appreciate you taking the time after a long day, as Martha said, to join us. And also just for your incredible work. Teachers are just what you all are doing right now. I just have to say a shout out to you all. You're doing incredibly hard work, and especially with little kids returning to school. We really appreciate all the efforts. I have 3 young kids of my own, and so I can see that they really do appreciate what teachers are doing, because they're so happy to be back in the classroom. So I'm going to show the agenda. We're going to show the agenda. We will first do some introductions, because we want to know about you. We want to know about what you teach, and where you are. We'll introduce ourselves too, and then we want to hear also from you about your goals, questions, challenges. We have a presentation that we've designed based on what we hope you're interested in, but we're happy to talk about other things as well. So we really want to make sure we are responsive to, the kinds of concerns that you are having, and questions, and listen to your ideas. We'll share a little bit about the research on elementary social studies and literacy, of course, with a focus on civics, civic education. We're going to think a lot about the ideas around community, compromise, diversity, justice, civic friendship. So we're not going to it's not going to be a long lecture or anything, but we wanted to at least give you a little bit of the background on that. And then we're going to dive into some field tested approaches that Jane, Maggie, and I have engaged in ourselves, that we know to be effective in accomplishing, effective integration of civics and literacy. And then we're going to actually have you engage in some activities, because we always think at these PD sessions, it's really helpful if you're actually doing some of the thinking that you might end up thinking about in your own and trying in your own classroom. So we want to make this engaging too, for you. So we'll do 2 different activities. And then we'll share a few resources at the end, some other, electronic sources that we think might be helpful for you to continue on with this work. And then we'll wrap up by, returning to the Padlet, where we're going to write down where you'll have your goals and questions. And again, we really hope that you'll have a takeaway from this, where it's like, what might you try on Monday? All of us, Jane, Maggie, and I have been to many PDs ourselves, and we know how important it is to get something out of this that you actually are going to, try on. And so we'll conclude with that. And we will, because this is a long session and teachers are not used to, having to sit, long periods of time, including ourselves, we'll do a 5-minute break somewhere probably in the middle between one of these activities. And that's our agenda.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I am so excited that I have the opportunity to work with you tonight. And I'm excited to share this strategy for what I call like a digital share out. And I had never heard of this strategy until recently in a meeting with some colleagues at MSU. And last year I taught during the pandemic in like a hybrid format. And wow, do I wish I had like a strategy like this in my toolbox. So the waterfall strategy is you can use it with any idea, any content. So we'll be doing our introductions with it. And as the facilitator or teacher, you just set a time frame. So like for us, I'll set aside 30 seconds because I'm going to want you to share out your name, the grade you teach, the content area that you are. And then I love food and I think it's always on my head. So I want to know your favorite snack. So what I'll do is let me get my timer pulled up. And then when I say go, you're going to just type into the chat without hitting enter those 4 things. And then after 30 seconds, I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, waterfall. And then everybody hits the enter key when I say waterfall. So let me go ahead and get the timer and start typing. All right, 3, 2, 1, waterfall. Oh, I love it. And you know what? I just realized I myself didn't even do it because I was so concerned about like watching the time. So I'm going to put my name.
I didn't do it either.
Okay, that makes me feel better. And my favorite snack is chips and salsa. Ooh, ice cream, popcorn. Oh, now I'm hungry. Barbecue chips. Yes. Well, thank you guys for sharing.
It's funny. I think, Martha, you're like leaving us on the in suspense here. My favorite food is.
I couldn't decide. I love most food. I couldn't decide.
I know it's hard.
Oh, great.
I love seeing all the different like areas represented: media literacy, grade 3, special education.
Yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you all for sharing this because it gives us, it's nice to have it in the chat too, because we can go back and look and see, what the areas represented are and the grades. So it looks like we have a really nice representation of grades.
Yeah.
Oh, and a pre-service teacher too. Wonderful. That's great.
Nice.
Great. So Maggie, do you want to go and introduce?
Oh, yes. Next slide. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. I'm Maggie. Before coming to MSU, I was a teacher in Ohio for 6 years. The picture with the two students, that's from my first classroom. And the student standing up, I actually just voted for him to be like Penn Station's Athlete of the Month or something. Right? I'm like, oh my God, saying I'm so little. But that was my first classroom. And then the other picture, that's from my middle school classroom where I taught like computer science and Project Lead the Way. In addition to being a classroom teacher, I did a couple different like supplemental activities, and some of my like notable ones is I was a project-based learning coach for that first elementary school district I worked for, and then a curriculum writer for Inquire Ed, and they focus on the science and social studies lessons in the elementary grades.
Great, and I'm Anne-Lise Halvorsen. As Martha mentioned, I'm a former kindergarten teacher. I also, when I was a kindergarten teacher, I wrote curriculum that were based in standards, state standards for Michigan. And I really, when I started doing that work, I realized how much I really loved curriculum design. That's standards-based, but that also can move beyond standards. And that's one thing we'll be talking about in this session. We've even taken a look at the New Hampshire standards to get a sense of what you are teaching in New Hampshire. I've been a professor at Michigan State for 15 years, and I teach a range of courses there. I teach elementary social studies methods courses. I teach the elementary literacy methods courses as well. I also teach some of the doctoral courses, quantitative methods, and history of education. I live in the city of Detroit, and as I mentioned, I have 3 kids. They are happily now back at school, and I am happy that they are back at school. They were, not that we were counting, but they had been out of school for 535 days. So we're very, very happy that they're back, and the school that they go to gives me a lot of great ideas for what to do in my own scholarship and in my teaching. And so I just, like I said, I love learning from teachers. And my scholarly foci are social studies education, curriculum reform, as Martha mentioned, history of elementary social studies, project-based learning, really interested in curricular integration in elementary literacy and social studies, but also with science and math too. And then I also focus on the discussion of public issues and historical inquiry. And you can see on the side books that I have co-authored, one based on my dissertation and an elementary social studies methods textbook, and a high school social studies textbook as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. And I'm going a little different route. There's no text for you to read. Hopefully I will be able to interpret these photos for you. Hi, everybody. I am Jane Lowe. I'm a bit of the oddball out in the sense that I didn't actually teach elementary school when I was a teacher. However, I'm super interested in what young kids can do. And so that's sort of my research area now, is focusing in that way. So the top right picture is actually kind of the work that I done previously on sort of middle school and high school project-based learning and how civic education can be done through experiential learning and PBL and things of that nature. And I'll share a little bit more about that later on today. And then the picture books that you see are the ones that are kind of my go-tos now and favorites. And Maggie later on will kind of show you what we mean by what we can do with these picture books to incorporate civic education and social studies more into elementary and lower grade learning. I have the College of Education picture there because I'm actually quite new to the College of Ed. This is only my second year at MSU. Prior to that, as Martha mentioned, I was a teacher in Texas, but I did my graduate degree in the University of Washington in Seattle, and then also was a professor in Florida. So in terms of standards and climates, I've sort of seen them all. And so hopefully some of that will help with any questions or concerns that you might have. And then the talk bubbles there is, that's one of my current focus area in terms of teaching and also research, is I care a lot about how we have discussions and how we talk about things and how we get young people to talk about things. And I actually have a book coming out in January that provides information and research for helping teachers K through 12 to do more discussion in the classroom. So I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about those kinds of things with you all. And so one of the first things that we want to get is just your ideas and your thoughts. And so I'm going to pop a link into the chat here, and that will take you to a Padlet. And I'm sure all of you are now familiar with what a Padlet is. But if you're not, it's just a way for people to share and work together on a digital platform. For now, please focus only on the first 3 boxes. And we just want you to kind of input, and you don't have to put your name or anything. It could be anonymous. Just what questions you have about elementary social studies, goals that you have for this session, and maybe challenges that you already face. So I'll give you a few minutes to just jot down some thoughts on those first 3 columns, and then we can talk about resources later on. And while you're doing that, I will actually show the page so everybody can see. If you click on the link, it should take you here, and all you do is click on the add sign and you can type a comment. So I'll give everybody a few minutes to do that.
Jane, let me just interrupt for 1 second to say, we forgot to mention this too. If we're really informal here, so if you have a question at any point or want to jump in and ask, a clarification question, or for us to expand on anything, please feel free. There will be time later on for questions, but if something comes up now, feel free to put it in the chat or to just unmute and ask us.
Give everybody a few more seconds. And by the way, I should say, this is not the only time you can work on this Padlet. So even as we're talking and things come up for you, please feel free to go back to this Padlet and add more comments or more questions, because we're going to be looking at this throughout and at the end of the session to make sure we answer all of your questions and the challenges that you feel like you're facing.
I have to say, these are so interesting and so good. It's making me think, gosh, we need a book out about to answer these questions. They're really, really good. Thank you for such thoughtful questions and challenges.
Yeah, and I definitely am seeing some themes of requiring resources, the crunch of time and constraints, and then of course things about controversy and the current political climate, and then of course age appropriate resources, and those kinds of things are always challenging for lower grades. And so hopefully some of the things that we will talk about today will address some of these things specifically, but also maybe peripherally. But if there's a burning question that we're just not addressing, like Anne-Lise said, feel free to either put it in the chat, somebody's always monitoring it, or just unmute and kind of chime in. We were all teachers, so feel free to interrupt us. We don't feel bad about that. So to kind of get us started in terms of some framing. So by the way, thank you so much for leaving your thoughts. And like I said, we'll continue to check back on that. To just get us started in framing, Anne-Lise pointed out that we actually did a little bit of digging into the standards and the kinds of things that you all are working with in New Hampshire. And the next couple of slides are just kind of going through how we see the integration of potentially some of these standards and kind of what we're going to talk about today. And so we noticed that from talking to Martha, the Educating for America Democracy is something that New Hampshire has either adopted or is in the process of adopting as part of their standards. And so I just wanted to, in case you don't know what EAD is, it might be a good resource for you to just consider and look at, and I'll put that link in the chat. And the diagram here is really like the simplest version of this. And I'll kind of talk through this diagram, but there are videos and resources. If you click on that website, it'll show you all sorts of things. And it is a K through 12 endeavor. And I will say that the resources for K through 5 are a little bit thinner, as you would expect, than 6 through 12. However, they are working really, really hard. The team of people that are working on this are working really, really hard to source and work on those resources. They're working with museums and nonprofits and other curriculum writers to try to build more robust resources for teachers. So if you don't find something right away, check back because they're always updating things on that website for resources for teachers. But essentially, this was a broad nationwide project, a coalition building project, if you will, that brought people together from the East Coast, the West Coast, in terms of different political spectrum and ideology, to try to think about how do we move, democratic education or civic education forward in a robust way in the nation. And it is relatively new, so this was launched just earlier this year. And so it has gained some traction in some states and perhaps not as much or well known in others, but it is an effort that has getting a lot of attention and will probably be around for a while. And so this is definitely a good place to look at resources. What you see there are the 7 different themes that they tried to think about what educating for democracy actually looks like in the United States. And the most succinct way I can talk about it is our existence in this country includes different opinions. You know this. There are different ideas and different ways of understanding the world. And the goal of EAD is to say education really ought to provide ways for young people to think about all of these different ways and to engage in these different ways of thinking, especially, coming against ideas that are different from theirs, right? Since we have so many different ways of knowing what it means to live well in this world and in this country. And so what EAD tries to do is say that these are really important things for young people to learn and they're capable of it. And so can we have a roadmap? So this is a roadmap. It's not a curriculum. It is a guidance document, a roadmap to say, how can we help students do that? And that's where the 7 themes come from. So rather than thinking about it as like a lot of content necessarily, these are divided thematically to think about the kinds of things that young people should engage with. So for example, if I just start at the top right, sort of the 1 o'clock position, civic participation. So no matter if you're K through 12, people should engage in sort of civically. So whether that's with the government or their communities. The next one, our changing landscape, is really history, but also current, and thinking about how the United States has changed as a country, how we're changing as a community. And we, the people, is connected to that because who we are has changed throughout time. And so helping young people grapple with what the we actually mean. And when we talk about we, the people. And a new government and constitution, you can think about, read that historically as literally the new government and constitution back in the 1800s and late 1700s, or you can talk about the ways in which the document continues to be updated today about current Supreme Court cases and things of that nature. And institutions and social reform, again, talks about and helps young people understand how government actually works and the ways in which people and young people especially can engage in change. And it says social transformation sort of purposefully because it's about transforming, not about changing or revolutionizing. It is just about updating, right? As the world continues, as social media technology changes, there are ways we need to update how we do things in the country. And a people in the world is more talking about global themes, like in what ways has the United States engaged or disengaged on the global platform. And then lastly, contemporary debates and possibilities obviously is talking about contemporary issues and things that go on. And this is all framed by talking about things that kids actually care about. And so it's not just kind of old history sorts of things, but really framed as things that children can discuss with their family members, with their peers, and things that people can engage with. And so I'll leave you there with the resource because there's a lot to unpack there, but things that we can discuss later on. And I know that New Hampshire is starting to look to EAD as one way to kind of incorporate into their standards. So I think Anne-Lise next will talk a little bit more about the standards.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jane. And, as Jane said, we took a look at the K-12 Social Studies New Hampshire curriculum framework because we wanted to get a sense, because education is, different state from state. And so we wanted to get a sense of what were the kinds of content, skills, values that were part of civic education, especially for K-3 in your state. And these were written in 2006. I was just part of a revisions process in Michigan where we revised our state standards, social studies standards, and it was very, very contentious and very, very difficult process. So we know how much work goes into, creating something like this, but it's really critical work because it really does inform, a lot of what we teach and a lot of what we assess. And so I just thought, I wanted to just mention a few that jumped out at me, some really good questions that I thought, and I was really impressed by a lot of the content of the curriculum framework in New Hampshire, because it really gets at the importance of civic content. Someone asked in the Padlet, like, what is social, what social studies content should we be focusing on? What content actually gets taught? But there's also the skill component to civics education, right? Because how you run your classroom, how decisions are made, as Jane mentioned, controversy, or even, people having different opinions. Well, kindergartners have very different opinions about things, right? As we know. And so it's just really important to think about civics content. Yes, there's concepts you could teach: authority, power, justice, liberty, and so forth, rules, laws, the local government, mayor, all these sort of content, like vocabulary, and how processes are made in a government. But it's also like how we live together in a community, how do we make a decision about, how we run our classroom and, how we take turns and how we spend our time outside, things like that. And so I just thought these questions about what does it mean to be part of a group, when and how do we speak up about something? This one I really appreciated because it, we're thinking about sort of issues of justice and injustice, and when children are excluded, we know that happens often in elementary classrooms. And so how do we speak up? How do children learn, like really scripts for how to speak up? Because it can be very hard to figure out, what do you say, to a friend or a peer who's doing something that you don't think is fair? How do you recognize it and how do you act on that? Another key component is social identity. What groups are we part of? What racial groups am I part of? What languages do I speak? All these things are really important parts of, civics education, because it's part of your identity and how people of different backgrounds can share similarities, but it is really important to also recognize our own identities as well. And so also thinking about responsibilities in a group, disagreeing about decision-making and decisions, who has power and authority to make changes, and why it's important to speak up when you are trying to make something better. And so we just wanted to share some of these questions because they really spoke to us in terms of like, these aren't just things that you read in a book or, sort of learn about directly from the teacher. These are things children teach each other, and they really speak to how a classroom is run. And so even, some colleagues of mine do something called stealth social studies, where someone mentioned here in the chat, there's not enough time, right? We totally agree with that. But my colleagues are working on something called stealth social studies, where they sneak social studies in. They get it in during snack time. They get it in during lunch. They get it in during math. That we are going to talk a little bit about all the sort of stealthy ways in which you can sneak social studies and especially civic education into your classroom. So on the next slide, if you don't mind advancing, Jane, I just wanted to share a little bit about research on integration of elementary social studies and literacy. And again, in the Padlet, some of you talked about this. And the three of us have done a lot of work on integration, both as teachers and as scholars, and we read about it a lot. And really, we feel that, life is integrated. Anytime you have to make a decision, a political decision, or just, a business decision, you're always integrating knowledge and content from multiple subject areas and disciplines. But what we found, and what others have found doing this research, is that integration has to be authentic. You can't force it. So what we're going to talk about a little bit later are problems and foci in projects, in which children naturally have to integrate math or economics or literacy. But it does need to be authentic. It shouldn't just be, well, I'm going to integrate this because I think it's a great way to save time. No, it really needs to be, children need to really see that there's a purpose of, combining and, drawing on multiple subjects. What we found too in our work is that, and I found this even with the student teachers whom I've supervised, is they'll say, I get this great social studies lesson, come in and watch, and I'll be so excited. And then I'm like, I watch it, and I'm like, actually, that was more of a literacy lesson. And I've also been there myself, so I know that challenge. So the thing is, you got to make sure that social studies isn't diluted. So just be careful that, sometimes I think, we all fall into this where we have a literacy activity or a socialized activity and it's integrated with literacy, but then the literacy kind of takes over. And so we want to be really protective of social studies and making sure that that knowledge and content gets diluted. It's not easy to do. I say this as somebody from personal experience, but it is a strong recommendation. And again, it's challenging to do effectively. We find that integration it's not easy. But it's worth the trouble. And then this last quote, I think, is just helpful from National Council for the Social Studies. The curriculum should not become, in the pursuit of integration, a grab bag of random social studies experiences that are related marginally to a theme or project. Rather, the concepts should be developed to assure coherence and meaning. And so it kind of gets back at the, the importance of authenticity when you're sort of designing activities. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to mention that, civics is impossible to teach without literacy. Like we really, we need civics, we need literacy, we need them both. When I think about teaching civics, you need children to develop understanding of key vocabulary terms. And this is one thing that I focus on a lot in my work in curriculum development, is like how to teach really complex concepts to kids and words to kids in ways that they can understand. And so almost always when I design curriculum, I create or find child-friendly definitions for these. Because you can go to the dictionary and find definitions for these terms, but they're not going to be anything a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old is really going to understand. And so, often, and kids will ask you, well, what do you mean by this? What does diversity actually mean? What does justice look like? And so finding good definitions, that's worth the effort. And so, in literacy is so focused on vocabulary. So we can't teach civics without literacy. There's also key documents that children will be reading, classroom constitution, laws, school policies, procedures that we follow. We need to be able to have literacy skills to really engage and read those documents. And then, of course, democratic participation entails those 4 strands of the Common Core state standards in English language arts: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And so to teach civics, you need to be able to have children, sharing the ideas, but also listening to one another. How do you listen carefully and be able to respond and disagree respectfully and so forth? And of course, reading and writing. And then on the next slide, sort of the flip is that literacy is impossible to teach without civics. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but this notion that children need content in order to read, they actually need to be reading and learning about something. And so this content knowledge is really, really critical. So we could say literacy is impossible to teach without geography and economics and history. Today, we're mostly focusing on civics. So the other key point we wanted to make is that speaking and listening standards, those standards require consideration of diverse perspectives. And so that's a very much a civic idea. This notion, as Jane mentioned earlier, that people disagree and they have different ideas, but they need to be able to at least consider why someone might be saying what they're saying and try to imagine that what they're saying has value, even if they disagree with them. So these two slides are just by way of sort of reinforcing the idea that really it's civics and literacy are authentically integrated. They really can be. And so I think in many ways it's challenging, but in many ways it's quite doable. So then on the next slide, these next slides I've borrowed from Nell Duke, who is a literacy expert. And I work a lot with her, and she's a literacy expert, and I'm in social studies, and we get along great. And but we can often see in the classroom that literacy can be sort of take on this sort of sort of reputation as a curricular bully. That literacy crowds in, the time spent with social studies and science too, because, we're talking about social studies today, but I'm sure you all have felt the crunch with science. There's never enough time for science education too. And so that's one way to think about it, is that literacy is, this curricular bully, but we might rather think about it another way, that literacy folks are really our allies. And we know all of you, of course, are literacy folks, self-identify as literacy folks. But we want to think too about, those of us who are really trying to emphasize the importance of civic education, social studies education. Let's see what we can borrow and learn from with literacy. Like how can we reinforce how those subjects reinforce each other rather than see them in direct, competition with each other for time. So all this is just by way of saying that we really do want to partner with our experts in literacy and, work effectively in those ways. And in fact, on the next slide, we have our friends at the Council for Chief State School Officers who created this wonderful infographic, and the link is below, which I don't know if anyone's seen it. It was produced in 2018. But it's literacy folks who are really emphasizing the damaging effects when social studies is marginalized. And we know across the whole country, we know there's little time for social studies education. And it's been like that for many, many, many years. And so it's a real problem, though, when our young kids are not getting opportunities to really learn about how to be civically engaged, how to learn that content, learn those processes, learn what values of equality and liberty and justice and diversity mean. And so this infographic is just very, very powerful, and it could be used if you are trying to talk with your administrator about, hey, we really need more time for social studies. Like this infographic might be a really good sort of evidence to show that, it can be pretty damaging when children don't have opportunities, for social studies education. And just so you know too, that, in that pie graph, you can see that social studies just has much less time. Social studies is in the yellow, than English and mathematics, or English language arts and mathematics, about equivalent with science. So there's just, we do have people who really care deeply in the literacy field about, making sure that students are getting access to high quality content in social studies. And in the next slide too, it says sort of another, just reinforcement of the importance of informational text, in grades K through 5, fulfilling the standards requires this 50-50 balance of informational and literary reading. And so informational texts are where they're going to be learning about, ideas and concepts and processes in civics education. And so we need those texts. And so that's another sort of piece of evidence of we need children reading these texts. And I think someone mentioned, okay, but where are these resources? And it's very true. It's very, very hard to find really good, high quality informational texts in civics education for really young students. Sometimes it's about creating it yourself. I'm working on a project right now where we're actually designing some of our own curriculum work ourselves presentations because we're not finding the exact books we need. And so, but as teachers, you know your students, the content, we really think it's great when teachers actually design, when they have time, their own resources to be able to, share some of the content they want to teach. So just, another piece of evidence though, that informational text is critical. We're supposed to be teaching this, and that's where we can get some of that social studies content in. So then on the next slide, I just wanted to hear from you all, and you can use the chat, or you can use the, or you can just unmute too. We want to think about how to integrate through writing. And so, because we know with K3, I know we're focusing on K3, although I think there's a teacher here who was in 4th grade too, which is great. That writing is a challenge, for real young children, but writing writ large, thinking about pictures, and just sort of diagrams and things like that. How can children write to be able to demonstrate civic knowledge? And so I've done a lot of work with teaching writing in my literacy methods course, and in so doing, children are learning different genres. But then they're also demonstrating knowledge about something that they have learned in terms of civics. So there's different kinds of texts we can think about. Procedural texts, like how to teach and I know you all know all this, but how to teach someone to do something. Informative explanatory, how to convey information about the natural, or in our case, the social world. Biography, interpreting and sharing the experiences of a real person. Nonfiction narrative, interpreting and sharing the story of a real event that has occurred. And then persuasive, influencing the reader's ideas or behaviors. So I was thinking, with the chat, or if you want to unmute, what are some authentic writing activities in civics education that we could get our K and 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th grades children doing? Like what, and I want you to think about, like, what might they want to be doing? Like what kinds of writing are you having them engage in, and what kind of writing might you have them engage in the future that might be one of these genres? So I'll stop talking and see if you have a chance to just, maybe think of some, examples. And this doesn't have to be a waterfall. You could just type up something and put it in. Okay, Cindy says, persuading the school to change a rule, allow gum or hats in school. Sounds like that's a real one. Yep, that's exactly right. And that's great, because children actually, the research shows that children write more, their writing is more high quality when there's an audience beyond their teacher. And so that would be really, really effective. That's something like that, to write to the school principal about something. I have a feeling they'll probably say no to gum, but maybe hats. A biography of a civic leader, absolutely. I think that's terrific. A wax museum for a biography, sharing experiences, stories of someone that is important from their community, absolutely. These are really great ideas for how to engage children in writing. And I can already see it, that's going to have an audience beyond the teacher. And I think events even that happen, something important that's happened in the community. We think in Michigan, where it's very exciting that, there's the primaries in New Hampshire, every 4 years. And so, thinking about documenting that and what happens, in how the sequence of events that occurs and something like that. And then procedural, kids really like to teach people how to do other things, So how do we decide, who is going to, take how we're going to decide taking turns in our classroom, or how are we going to learn to make decisions together as a community? These are things that children can engage in ways that are pretty authentic. And so any of these writing techniques would be a way that in which you could get your students to be writing, but in a way that is, demonstrating their civic knowledge. Classroom constitution, personal story of immigration. These are excellent. These are excellent examples. And so again, what I love about all your examples too, is that they will allow social studies to rise up and be centered, not literacy taking over. Using and writing about historical artifacts to understand the past. Oh, absolutely. And children love touching things. They love those artifacts. They love touching things from the past. and so forth, and really, looking at what children used in the past and toys and things at school, desk materials in the classroom. They love those kinds of things. So these are great examples, and I think they really would be very authentic for kids. And then in the next slide, I'll just share with you, this is the beauty of having my own children. I can use their stuff whenever I want. This is by my son Tobin, and this is from a number of years ago when there was a concern about funding cut to Meals on Wheels. And so my son Toby cares deeply about his grandmother. He loves his grandmother so much. And so he got really concerned about this, even though I don't think she uses Meals on Wheels, but he was very concerned about this funding cut. So I use these graphic organizers a lot. I think this might have been a day he was off school or something and I needed to occupy his time. And so I really like this, and I think this might have been third grade, a graphic organizer, because the children really do. And I can't say strongly, I love these graphic organizers because they really help children structure their ideas. So in my opinion, I do not think that we should cut Meals on Wheels, many million exclamation points. And then the reasons: most elders won't have food. Other countries take care of the elders, and elders deserve to be treated well. And why readers should agree with my opinion? Well, and a lot of people agree with me. And so, this is very much a civics activity that he engaged in, and it was something that he cared, deeply about. And so this is just one example I wanted to share with you. My children are doing a lot of writing to their representatives and their senators, because I suggest it as an idea, but what they love is actually when they get letters back in the mail. And so it's actually it does take a while, but they do like getting that. So that's another thing to think about with the children, having them reach out to their representatives, because they will get a response, and it's really exciting to them to think, wow, someone actually read what I wrote. One more slide I have too. I just wanted to share some other curricular and instructional approaches and activities that use integration. We're not going to go through all of these today, but they, there are quite a few that really do it authentically. Some of them I think mentioned inquiry, the inquiry approach is, historical inquiry or civic inquiry, but anything where children are actually exploring the answer to a question that they care about, where they're gathering evidence and data, and they're analyzing that, and they're responding to it. Inquiry, children, we know children love questions, right? And so anything that involves them conducting an inquiry is going to naturally integrate literacy and civics. Discussions. I think somebody mentioned too in the Padlet, discussing controversial issues, like that's a challenge I have, and believe me, I know all that all too well. But discussions are really important for children to engage in. They use speaking and listening when they're doing that. They also use reading because they need to read to be able to have some ideas or oftentimes they need to read to have ideas to discuss. Sometimes they might do a writing activity after the discussion. Hey, did your opinion about this change? If so, why? But these actually, they do really integrate literacy. Journey boxes, there's a link there. We're not going to talk about these today. I actually don't have any experience teaching these myself, but I really love looking at other people's journey boxes where teachers have a topic in which they collect a lot of artifacts. Somebody mentioned artifacts. And so these journey boxes might cover a particular person or an event or something. And so the journey box is a collection of artifacts that help children, they can investigate and answer questions about in order to ask a broader question about the significance of the event or person or so forth. But they can come in a lot of different forms, but that's another one that naturally integrates them. Service learning and any sort of community engaged learning. Anytime children are doing something, and to work in their community, that's going to involve, some kind of reading and writing and speaking. But those kinds of skills are really important. Children love anything with service learning too, because it feels like they're making a difference. Of course, videos, blogs, any other digital activities. They naturally have to, draw on children's writing skills really to be able to, share their ideas publicly or with others. Project-based learning and interactive read-alouds. I won't go into that in depth now, but those are two approaches that we're going to share about today that naturally integrate curriculum or essentially integrate literacy. I'm sure there's many more, but this was just some that we came off the top of our head.
Yeah, and so I'm also cognizant of sort of the time. It might be that time for us to just have a little bit of a stretch break, drink some water, run to the restroom, whatever it is, because when we come back, we kind of front loaded a lot of this and it's a lot of information. So we try to put it in as many of the links as possible in the chat, and hopefully that's something that Martha can collect and send out to you all afterwards. But these are just kind of a general overview of the different ways in which we can genuinely integrate, right, social studies into things that you probably are already doing with your students. Just thinking about thematically, right, topically, what are things you can shift a little bit, and so kids can still be practicing reading and writing, but just really with a heavy social studies specific content, and using those themes. And so why don't we take about a 5-minute break or so, and then when we come back, we're going to highlight the last two that's on the slide here, something we can do with project-based learning specifically, and Maggie is actually going to lead us in an interactive read aloud so you can see how it's done. So we'll see you back in about 5 minutes. Great, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had a good break. I always tell my students that we have, like 3-hour-long classes. I try not to go more than 45 minutes or 50 minutes without a break. Yeah, it's a lot to sit through. So hopefully that was a good break for everybody. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to spend the second part now of this, this time together, thinking a little bit more specifically about 2 ways in which you can incorporate social studies into sort of your everyday teaching. And one way of that is project-based learning, and short for PBL. Many of you might know about this already, but a lot of people engage with projects as sort of a end of the unit sort of thing, right? Like you learn a bunch of stuff and then you do a project. A PBL is very different from that. It's a way to kind of have students work on something throughout the entire process and using the project to actually learn the things that they're doing. So here's just some major tenets of project-based learning, or PBL, for you to consider. It's working towards something with an extended period of time. Again, it's not just a one project that you do at the end, but it usually takes a couple of weeks at least. The second is projects are a primary driver of learning during a unit, right? Again, as well as the culminating. So it's the fact that kids are learning through the projects and not just doing the project as a presentation at the end. The importance of necessary roles. And so what that means is for kids to do a project, then they need to feel like they have ownership over it. So thinking about what roles kids can take. Now, that could be fictitious roles like in a simulation, or just roles as recorders, managers, whatever that is, as part of the project. But having those integral roles for every kid is really, really important so that they can feel like they're working on something and being part of a team. Something we like to call engagement first. And what that means is the project should really grasp the kids, Whether they know anything about that content at all at the beginning is sort of, it doesn't matter, because the idea is you want to engage them, have them be excited and be motivated about doing the project even before they know anything. And it's that motivation and that engagement that will drive them to want to learn more about the things that they're doing. So that becomes really, really important, to have something that kids are really, really into. As you'll see in a little bit, soliciting ideas from kids is actually the best way to do that, because the stuff they're already excited about. And then it creates a need to know. And what that means is when I'm excited about something, I want to know more about it. And so getting kids to ask those questions and developing projects around things that they're already interested in can help them foster that curiosity. And all of a sudden you have kids who actually want to read more about it. They want to listen to podcasts or watch videos about that topic because it's something that they actually want to know about. And especially if you have a project that requires them to, write a report, create something, now they literally have a need to know what it is that they have to present on. And having that, the brain sciences is pretty clear that we actually retain information a lot better when we have something to hang on to literally in our brains. And so if kids are motivated to do that, they have that engagement, and then they have a reason to actually know something, they will remember things a lot better than if they had no reason to learn it to begin with. And then the last thing is, of course, purpose beyond doing school. And that's sort of, you can see that as a culmination of all of the other ones, but making sure that the project really has meaning. And it's not just something that they do for school, or not just something that's going to end up being hung in the hallway, which we love those, right? Projects that teachers can hang in the hallway in the classroom, but it really should be something that goes beyond just the school. And that's because that relevance for kids, going back to engagement first, right? They need to be able to see that what they're doing matters more than just the classroom grade or the classroom, whatever it is. So they have to be able to see that the project that they're doing is actually impactful. And so those are sort of the major tenets of what we mean when we talk about this high quality PBL. And then generally speaking, PBL also should involve these things. So what that means is they should let kids exercise some autonomy, voice, and choice. So kind of like what I was saying, letting them choose what project they want to work on and how they do it. Opportunities for kids to work together. As we know, that's a really important skill, more and more so these days, and that learning how to work with one another. So that's an important part of projects. Opportunities for them to reflect and adapt over the course of the project, right? Because we know as adults, we rarely get things right the first time. There's an iterative process anytime we do something. But too often in school, we assume like, hey, the kid needs to do this assignment and they need to do it right the first time, right? So within project, there's that wiggle room to help them try something. Oh, wait, if it didn't work, they need to go back and, okay, why didn't it work? So having opportunity to try out something multiple times is a really, really great way for them to deepen that learning. And that is something, the iterative learning is something we call looping, right? Meaning kids are going back to the same content, or they back to the same concept or skill, so they have multiple chances to try. It should incorporate an integration of multiple domains. Is everything we've been talking about so far. So beyond just literacy, you can imagine a project that kids care about in the community could include science and social studies. Oftentimes, especially with some of the climate change things that we're talking about, it's not just science, it's both science and social studies, or even things that they care about in their community could be integrations of math. It could be integrations with writing, literacy, or science and other social studies subject areas. And then, of course, as I mentioned, connection to the world outside of school is so important that it's on here twice. So it's just one of those things that we can't push this enough to remind everybody that kids have a life outside of school. School isn't the only thing that they do. And the more we can do to integrate those things for kids is really, really important. And so here are just some criteria for a high quality PBL, and that you can read these yourself and I don't have to read them at you, but in case you wanted to read more about it or learn more about it, here's a link that will give you some of this information and kind of show you all of the various tenets if you decide that this is something that you want to kind of take on and think about doing. And I think, Anne-Lise, next you're going to actually showcase an example of something that you've done with younger kids around PBL.
That's right, Jane. And I just want to say too that project-based learning is it's great, but it's really challenging. It's messy, it's time consuming, it's really fun. But I'm going to show this video next, and I'm featured in it a little bit, but that's not why I wanted to show it. I wanted to show it because it's actually, you're going to hear from kids talking about what the project means to them. You're going to hear from an administrator, and you're going to hear from teachers, because it's much more important for us to think about, like, what are the recipients of this and the creators of this, project-based learning, how are they experiencing it? How is it meaningful to them? And this was a project I worked on with Nell Duke and other colleagues from University of Michigan and Michigan State University, in which you'll hear about it, but it was a highly collaborative effort. And it took a long time. As Jane said, just like with kids, with iterative, you don't get it right the first time. With this project, we worked on many, many iterations of this curriculum. And so, but the reason we want to show it to you is that, at some point, if you might want to design your own project-based learning, but you might want to teach something that someone else has used. And so actually this link will take you to some of these. These are for second grade. And that link will take you to some of the units that are designed and available, and so you could adapt them, for use in your community, or take parts of it that are meaningful to you. There's one in civics, there's one in economics, there's one in history, and there's one in geography. So this one's going to be about the civics one. So you can go ahead and press play, Jane. Thank you.
In the US, we have a persistent gap in the achievement of kids who live in poverty and kids in wealthy communities.
What's this over here?
Project-based learning is a very powerful tool to connect students with their communities, with real purposes and audiences, and it does appear to be an effective way of improving student achievement. My name is Anne-Lise Halvorsen, and along with Nell Duke, we designed curricula that integrated literacy and social studies using project-based learning. Project PLACE stands for Project Approach to Literacy and Civic Engagement. We designed 4 big projects. We aligned the units around the literacy standards and social studies standards for second grade. Then we commenced a fairly large study to test the impact in high poverty, low performing school districts. Our study was with 48 different classrooms in 20 elementary schools. Half of them were assigned to teach the projects that we designed, and half of them were asked to teach the regular social studies curriculum. Teachers were randomly assigned to do project-based learning or not. These were teachers who did not have prior experience doing project-based learning. They taught 60 lessons, and we tested children at the end of the school year. We found that students who received project-based learning scored at higher levels in reading and social studies. So that tells us that a project-based framework can be successful right out of the gate.
So this morning, we are going to go on our field trip to Hawthorne Park. My name's Aaron Phillips. I teach second grade at Grayson Elementary. We are doing the Civics and Government unit of Project PLACE. We started the unit by taking a field trip. Go ahead, guys. We go to a park and kind of just discover the park and look at its strengths and weaknesses. All the kids were engaged, all the kids were interested. That is when they can shine, and you can see a total difference in the learning.
It was very exciting for our kids to feel that they had a voice in what could possibly promote change.
Wow!
Right away, the driving purpose to improve the park or other public space is established.
All right, let's start heading towards the bus.
Every lesson, there's a direct connection between what students are doing and that ultimate purpose that they have.
So the ground of the play structure was not safe.
We were writing things that you did not like and you think that you can fix. You could fall down. There's no wood chips and the weed barriers are coming out.
Does anybody have any ideas of something we could do?
We could say to the person who made the park to fix the park.
Our hope was that students would see that they're valuable contributing members to a community and they can make a difference.
I wonder if we could try to persuade people in the government to fix something at the park. We learned how to write a proposal. They got to create posters for the different departments within local government. So what does the sanitation department do to help citizens?
Helps the environment be clean.
There you go.
Children are curious about the world around them. They're curious about issues in their community and what adults do.
Is this what your group did, Kaylee?
So civic education is really an important part of students becoming functioning citizens who are contributing and are active in their communities.
Make the play area safer.
We took the work and made it into a PowerPoint presentation to ultimately present it to somebody on City Council.
Today is the proposing day where we propose to the councilman.
Hi, I'm City Councilman Randy Carter.
We know from research children's writing tends to be stronger when they are writing for an audience beyond school.
Good morning and welcome to Grayson Elementary.
Part of it is that project-based learning conveys high expectations for students.
Our class suggested adding more wood chips.
As much as possible, we want to give kids an opportunity to write for an audience that's not just their teacher, but maybe members of their local community, their state, their nation, or the world.
Councilman Carter, we hope you enjoyed our hard work.
They were able to show me with pictures and data exactly what the problems are. I will act upon their proposal immediately. Can we say Grayson Gators get things done?
It just makes myself proud that I'm helping the whole community.
Project-based learning gives children of all ages, of all status, of all diversity, an opportunity to have a voice. I see the level of engagement. I see that the learning becomes contagious. And I see that years later, kids come back to me and talk about the projects.
We were excited about conducting this study to be able to really say project-based learning can make a difference in children's achievement at the elementary level. It's a great alternative to traditional approaches to learning.
Oh, yeah!
So we hope that gives you a sense of what project-based learning, can be. We also want to emphasize that there's many different approaches, many different projects, many different things that children engage in. Maggie's done this with middle school level. There's, Jane's worked a lot with high school level, elementary. We can do it at any grade level, but we found that it's really exciting for kids. And so what we wanted to do next is actually have you in small groups, we're going to do breakout rooms, think about a real world problem, real world issues in your school, local community, state, country, even the world, something that you're hearing your students talk about, like what's on their minds, what do they care about, what are they questioning, what are they confused about. And so as you do that, think about also a topic that's aligned with the standards too, because one of the things, we really feel strongly about is that, this is not a free for all. This is like actually project-based learning is grounded it can be grounded in the standards. And, the standards, I think, the ones we looked at in New Hampshire are written broadly enough that there's lots and lots of great topics that can fit within those standards. You might also want to think about your own network of experts who could be authentic audience members. So do you have a friend or a family member, in real estate, or, somebody who works for the Parks and Rec department, or, who works at the library, things like that, where it's like you actually know someone who would actually be excited to come to the school and, listen to a presentation by kids or read something that the children have written. Let's see, I think I lost the train of thought here, a project that children something, but it probably is about excitement or something. A project that students could collaborate on in ways that, because this is not just an individual activity, that this is highly collaborative. Topic that lends itself to curricular integration, a topic that engages students in justice. And we really want to think about, the importance of how do we make the world a better place? Children care deeply about that. And then how will literacy be integrated into civic education? And so we don't expect, a fledged project right now. It's just more about like, what are some cool activities you might want to think about doing and having your children engage in. So we're thinking about maybe, I don't know, 5-7 minutes. Does that seem?
So in a minute, I'm going to put everybody into a breakout room. And so hopefully that'll be a smaller, easier place to kind of for you to think through some ideas. And in the chat, I'm placing a link to a Jamboard where you can jot down your ideas, and feel free to just claim a section of that board anywhere. And you can click on the text box thing and it'll populate a text box for you to type in. But if someone in your group would take notes and just kind of jot down, as Anne-Lise said, just some general ideas of projects that you think your students might actually be excited about or want to engage in. And so I will, does anybody have any questions about what we're about to do? All right, great. So I will set this up and have it's about 8 minutes, Anne-Lise, you say? Okay, great.
Yeah.
There'll be a nice little clock on the top corner that counts down, like, yeah. All right, here we go.
Thank you.
And Martha, if you will join room 1, since you're a host, I can't.
Sure.
And then I will join room 3.
Let me see. So how do I do that?
I
go to breakout room. Okay.
Yep. And then just click on room 1 and join.
Okay. Okay. Room 1.
The jarring yank back of Zoom. Sorry
Yes,
about
I
that,
know.
everybody.
A conversation just got cut off. Yeah. Hopefully you can continue it on at some point. But these are great. I'm just looking at some of these in the Jamboard document. Can do a project that puts students in particular roles, making them experts. Yep, to work together. Absolutely. And children love that. Recycling projects. Absolutely. Oh, I love that. And that was great to integrating science. Yeah, another recycling one. Economics, yep. Starting with local issues, environmental issues, a landfill. Oh my gosh, kids are obsessed. Where does the trash go? Like, they just love that question. Where does the trash go? Farm to table, absolutely love that. That's similar to one our group talked about in terms of community gardens. We also talked about historical projects relating to the history of the local community and civic zines, like having children actually author, articles for, a publication that others could read. So these are great. And what I love about them too is that it could be a 6-week project, it could be a year-long project, or some of these you could really pare down to do in a couple days, do something. Projects do tend to take over an extended period of time, but maybe if you have a week where you could devote to something like this, it's quite meaningful to kids and they get excited about that. Great, so thank you. And I think now we're going to move on to another activity. You're on mute, Maggie.
I know. I was like, wait a minute.
I know, the line of 2020.
Right. You're muted. Yeah. So I really love using picture books, and I have 2 physical ones here that I have always used in my classroom. This is We the Kids, and this is Chrysanthemum. And I use these in my elementary school classroom, middle school, and even at MSU with my undergrads. And actually, we're going to get to do like a small group thing with The Proudest Blue, which is an awesome book that I feel like deals with similar issues of like bullying and how we treat each other and self-esteem. And I'm almost thinking about swapping this one out for now, The Proudest Blue. But the book that, oh, well, before I get into the book that we're going to look at today, thinking back to the Padlet and like the goals and kind of challenges that you guys had, I think avoiding controversy is definitely like a tough thing, or just controversy in general is tough to grapple with young students, because it's like, how do you find those resources and how do you balance that? And I feel like picture books do a great job with that, because students can look at the characters and identify things within the characters or how they're interacting, and it just seems to make it more accessible to them, like thinking about like, how do you talk about and define like big words like justice or bravery, or and I just think that looking at it through the lens of a character in a book really just makes it more accessible to younger students. But also, like with my older students, I used to tell them, it's not every day that a teacher is going to read a book to you, and you are not too old for this. So, I feel like they are totally appropriate at any level. So the book we're going to look at today is called Let the Children March, and it's by Monica Clark Robinson. And I love this modeling a read aloud link. It's going to take us to a like virtual bookshelf. And I think this is great, especially for like how we're now incorporating like digital learning and digital resources, like post-pandemic now. And even last year when I was, teaching in a hybrid format, I would set up my document camera and put the book underneath and read aloud too. And sometimes if I had an asynchronous or needed them to do an asynchronous activity, I would often, have a couple questions with them. And I used to use Screencast-O-Matic and Edpuzzle, and I just feel like there's really good resources out there for like, recording yourself, or there are lots of really great ones online. And that's the one that I'm going to feature with you today. So I'm not the one reading it in the video. But yeah, so Dr. Lowe, do you mind pulling that up for us?
And we can't hear the volume, Jane.
I fear that when I shared, when I got yanked back into the Zoom room. So let me do this real quick and make sure share sound and try again.
Good morning and welcome back to another edition of Sankofa Read Aloud. Today's story is titled Let the Children March, written by Monica Clark Robinson, illustrated by Frank Morrison. I hope that you enjoy this story. 1963, Birmingham, Alabama. I couldn't play on the same playground as the white kids. I couldn't go to their schools. I couldn't drink from their water fountains. There were so many things I couldn't do. One warm spring night, my family went to church. We weren't there to have regular services. We were there to hear Dr. King speak. We were there to plan. He wanted to raise an army of peaceful protesters to fight for freedom, his brown eyes flashing fire and love. Dr. King told us the time had come to march. If I march, Mama said, I'll lose my job. Sure enough, I can't march, Daddy said. I got a family to feed. The weight of the world rested on our parents' shoulders. But this burden, this time, did not have to be theirs to bear. I don't have a boss to fear, my brother said, or a job to lose. We can march this time. We'll be Dr. King's army, I said. I'll be fine, Daddy, I promise. Don't worry, Mama. Dr. King didn't like children being put in harm's way. He was a daddy too, after all. But he said that though we were young, we were not too young to want our freedom. Let the children march. They will lead the way. On May 2nd, a sunny Thursday, boys and girls, brothers and sisters, cousins and friends, we all met at the church, dressed in our best, feet ready. In a silence so loud that all I could hear was my racing heart, we began to walk. Hand in hand, we marched, so frightened, yet certain of what was right for freedom. The path may be long and troubled, but I'm gonna walk on.
So stopping here, and you know what, actually, Dr. Lowe, I think I wrote down the wrong time. I wonder if I meant to write down 3:09. Can you go for about another minute for
Would
me?
I be hurt?
Thank you.
Would we be heard? Would it all be worth it in the end? I wanted to run from the angry faces in the crowd, run from danger, run from fear. Boys and girls, brothers and sisters, cousins and friends, on and on we marched. We marched, we marched, singing the songs of freedom, 1,000 strong we came. Hate dogged my heels all that day, its yellow canine teeth sharp, but courage walked by my side and kept me going. Disperse or you'll be jailed, the police shouted the first day. Disperse or you'll get wet, the police shouted the second day. Disperse or we'll release the dogs, the police shouted the third day. We did not disperse. We kept on marching. We wouldn't stop until things started to change. Hundreds of us went to jail on the first day, and even more on the second. My turn wasn't until the third day, after I was sprayed by water stronger than anything I've ever felt. Rough hands pushed me forward, and I fell to my knees in the police wagon. I was going to jail.
Thank you. So I want to stop and pause here for a moment and think about the question, how are these children demonstrating bravery? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself and kind of just say what you think, or feel free to write something into the chat. But how do you think these children are demonstrating bravery? Yeah, Claire, still going back day after day, marching for freedom, even when their parents can't, stepping up for their family. Absolutely. And I think on the one page where it showed all the children standing there, it spoke to how fearful they were. And when I talk about bravery, like especially like with little children, I talk about, feelings associated, with that. And I think like to me, bravery is working through your fear to push through. And yes, not giving up. Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Lowe, you can hit play.
Dr. King reassured our parents, "Don't worry about your children," he said. "They're going to be all right. Don't hold them back if they want to go to jail, for they are doing a job for not only themselves, but for all of America and for all mankind." That night, crowded into a cell too small for even half of the kids, we sang, "We shall overcome. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. And freedom is coming." Our parents couldn't be there with us, but still we sang, wrapped in the proud and loving arms of our ancestors. I was still in jail, but we heard that the next day and the next, more kids marched. The water hoses they used to sting us could not stop our fierce tide. The path may be long and troubled, but I'm going to walk on. Turn the other cheek.
Thank you. And so at this point, I have two questions, and they're kind of reflections of each other. So the first question is, how did these children support their community? And then the second question, and we can kind of think of them together, is how did the community support these children? So feel free to take a minute and think about it and type your answer into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself.
Can you repeat the question, Maggie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the first one is, how did these children support their community? And then how did the community in turn support these children? Thank you. The children were helping their community to make things more fair. Absolutely. Children were marching so that everyone can have rights, right? And the children were marching because their parents couldn't, right? So yeah, taking a stand against something they viewed as wrong. Absolutely. And then when we think about the adults' role here, because the adults, their parents are saying, I can't afford to lose my job. I have to go to work. Dr. King saying, don't worry, your children are going to be safe. They're going to be okay. So when we think about like the adults' role in supporting the children, I think about what does that look like? And I think in my eyes, it's, pulling from your family, your family strength, your community strength. They talked about when they were in the jail, they rallied around together and sang. And I think that really speaks to the community, supporting them or just having a sense of community. And that's really important when you're trying to be brave and trying to make changes, I think. Can you play the video for me? Thank you.
We had been taught, show love where there is hate. The world watched as hate bruised us, but for 7 days we walked only in love. The jails swelled to bursting, and even President Kennedy took notice. Daddy said the president received letters and calls about us from all over the world. Our march would have become a memory, a small part of a larger story, but we had been heard, and the seeds of the revolution were sown. 2 days and nights I stayed in jail. Some stayed even longer. When I left, I was tired and sore, and my best dress was ripped, but my smile was wide as a Mississippi River. I had made a difference. I'm so proud of you, baby girl, Mommy said. Your march was what made them see. With nothing more than our feet, voices, and courage, we had done what others could not. Change was right around the corner. We felt like a cool breeze in an Alabama August. On May 10th, the great news rang out. Dr. King had reached an agreement with the white leaders of the city. Desegregation would begin. 1 month later, I was playing on a playground I'd never been allowed to play on before. 2 months later, my family ate at a diner we'd never been allowed to eat in before. Our march made the difference. We children led the way. Singing the songs of freedom, 1,000 strong, we came.
Thank you. So one last question I have is, how can children make a difference? And feel free to type into the chat or unmute yourself. Thank you, Mackenzie. Yeah, they can unite to tackle a common goal. Yep, Chris, be involved. Absolutely. Really using their voice. Yeah, speaking up, supporting each other. I think those are very two strong things that we see in that book. Speaking up when something is not right. Yeah, and knowing like how to do that, right? Because it's like such a difficult thing. Standing up to solve when something is wrong. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for your responses with this. And to give you like a, to give you some insight as to the teacher side of things or the facilitator side of things. So when I think about what kind of topics I want kids to talk about and what kind of questions I want them to engage with, I think of how and why questions, something that is going to be a little more open-ended, so students really feel like they can talk through stuff, explain themselves. And when we have these conversations in classrooms, I often try to help kids like talk directly with one another, what I call more of like a volleyball style of conversation versus always coming back to me. And when I think about a picture book and how many questions I want to stop and ask, I usually feel like stopping about 2 times, 2 or 3 times, and then the end. So when I think about preparing questions, I usually try to prepare about 4 to 6. And then depending on the depth of conversation or how much support the students need from me in having a conversation, I can add more or less.
And I do just want to point out, how many of you have read this book or used this book already? I'm just curious. Anybody? Did it? Yeah. So great. A couple of people, it looks like, but yeah. So like these resources and the link that I sent, feel free to check these books out, and they're great ways to introduce some of these topics. And by the way, the Children's March was a real thing, right? So like obviously this is the book, but it is actually writing about a historic event that did happen in history, and then writing it in a picture book in a way for kids can digest it, even though it was a very tumultuous time, of course, in history, and the event was fairly, you can imagine, scary for kids and all of these kinds of things. But it's one of the great things about storybooks is putting it in ways that kids can understand and can relate to. Sorry, Maggie, I didn't.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. So when we think about questions for read alouds, what big ideas and goals do you have for your book? So, with this one, I would say the big idea and goal is thinking about how students and children can make changes, how adults in their life can support them for that. And it's really just also like a big thing was community. And so when I think back to the books that I showed you earlier, like I intentionally picked these books because they helped me craft a classroom constitution. And so I do think that like the themes and books those big ideas can really help you with like pulling out big themes like community and stuff like that. And then what kinds of questions should we be asking students to consider? Again, those like open-ended how and why, and questions that deal with those big words like justice. That's not something that you can just define one time, and it's something that you have to keep coming back to, or what is community? How do you build community? And then where to pause naturally in books. So I tried to, like, my questions were, bravery and really bringing this idea that you push through fear when you're being brave. And then the mirrored question I had, that was really to draw attention to how the adults in that situation were supporting those children. So yeah, that's kind of how I planned it.
Thank you so much, Maggie. And I hope you all obviously Zoom is not the greatest way to do this, but I'm so glad Maggie is showing you that even on Zoom, you can do something like this that's soliciting kids to engage in different ways. And so hopefully you can use these 3 questions as ways to engage any pictured book that you already use in your classroom. So I know I'm cognizant of time. So at this juncture, we kind of wanted to revisit the Padlet and think about the questions that you had and see if we were able to answer any of them, or feel free to highlight anything that you feel like we need to talk about a little bit more in the next few minutes.
I'm wondering if you have a list of storybooks that you vetted. I know Maggie just shared about 3 or so. Do you have others you might be able to share for this age group? And the second question I had was about controversy, and how and just what your thoughts are about that. I think teachers on this webinar are aware of a new law, and are a little bit unclear, because the law is unclear about what to do. So just, I guess, any thoughts about those two topics from you would be appreciated.
I'll just jump in and say I have a whole bunch of really good texts that I can share. It'll take me a little bit of time to compile them, but I'll get those to you, Martha, and maybe you could
Great. Thank you.
attendees, any of them, and they've been vetted, and they're books that we think are really effective. But I really appreciate your question about controversy and what a difficult position teachers are in. With regard to the law, and there's laws around the state. There's a bill proposed in Michigan, but it's something that even before these laws and bills were passed, I as a teacher, I taught about topics that were controversial, but my biggest sort of advice, or what I found, is that I over communicated with families. Like, I let them know. First I built relationships with them. I'm sure all of you, that's what you do anyway. But then I actually let them know ahead of time, this is what we're teaching, and this is why we're teaching it. And again, I went back to the standards. I said, because I once had some parents asking, like, why are you teaching about, Islam? I'm like, well, actually, there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is that they are in the standards. And so that's expectation. The state is requiring us to teach about this. But, of course, there's many other really good reasons to think about, informing oneself about religious diversity and so forth. But the standards, response was a very safe one to use, and the other thing too is, I think, just being in communication with administrators and making sure they're aware. And I think this book that Maggie had read, is a historical context. And I think, Martha, if I'm remembering correctly, that with teaching about sort of any sort of, controversial, or, in my mind, this is not controversial, but, many people might see it this way, like, in the past, it's okay. It's more contemporary. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. The guidance document that came out said it's okay to teach history, and that there obviously that racism did play a role in our history. So yeah. So
yeah. So speaking
right.
about that. So.
Right.
Maggie or Jane, anything else you want to add?
I was just going to chime in. I mean, I echo everything that Anne-Lise said. And I think in terms of bills like these ones are really meant to intimidate teachers, I think, in terms of taking away teacher autonomy and thinking about what they can do in their classroom. It's less about, I hate to think about it this way, but it's really less about dictating what a particular kind of way of teaching, and more about just taking away some of that teacher autonomy. And so I know it's hard to think about it this way, but I think leaning on the standards, but then being true to, we trust your professionalism as teachers. And I think I just want to add that you should trust yourself in terms of your professionalism and as teachers as well, and to lean on the standards in these ways, and to know that kids have the right to learn about things, and that it's really important for them to learn about things. And I don't mean things that are super controversial or things like that, but sometimes things that are super generic are controversial. And so even like the children's marches, I think that happen, and someone might see that as being controversial, but I would encourage you to, like Anne-Lise said, right, communicate to the parents and communicate, say, hey, we're talking about something that really important that happened in history, but we're also going to talk about why this made us better, right? Like how this is helping us and helping kids learn more about who they are and how they should be in the community, which really is what school should be about, right? Getting kids together in those ways.
And just to like, yes, and onto that, I think like, especially when I was like a new teacher starting out, I leaned on like professional organizations, like looking at NCSS and like EAD and seeing that like there are, ways to grapple with these tough things, and that there are organizations that state best practices that, really support teachers in picking up these practices and kind of disrupting what we've seen traditionally.
Thank you. I'm just taking some notes on the chat. So, as this is what I heard you say: over communicate with people, parents, administrators, build relationships with families as you always do, but maybe even more so. Reference the standards and make sure that you are teaching to the standards, and lean on professional organizations. Is that a good summary? Thank you. I'm looking for any kind of guidance that I can find. So I really, really appreciate that. I don't know if you had anything else or anybody else had any questions while we have these brilliant people here. I think everyone's.
Well, I was about to pass it back. The teachers are the brilliant ones, really. You all have been doing great. I would love to hear what the teachers are doing.
And while we're compiling resources, just by the way, here are some resources of things that we kind of talked about today beyond the standards. And I'm putting the links in the chat right now of these ones that we have on here, just as a separate thing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was keeping a list of all the great resources, but it sounds like you have them. You have them already. Thank you.
That's good. Wonderful. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have resources for good like virtual field trips. Because of what's been going on, we haven't been able to, go to the State House or and just some, or ones that are like reasonably priced but are good experiences for kids.
That's such a good question, Sydney, because during the early pandemic, that's what I had before there was Zoom school. I would just had my kids like go to like museums, the African American Museum of Culture in Washington, D.C., just, historical sites. I can try to find that list too and share it with Martha, because I found so many that were great. And the kids were really excited about the virtual trips. So, yeah. And then on that other resources slide, it's just, there's this wonderful organization. It used to be called the Buck, I think it's still called the Buck Institute, but they have a collection of resources called PBL Works. It just, basically you just put in a topic, a grade level, subject area, and you will generate, it'll generate a whole bunch of different cool projects that you could, take and adapt and use. The New York State K-12 Social Studies Resource Kit, I thought, sort of in your all's part of the country, but there's probably, I'm sure, a lot of overlap between New York state standards and New Hampshire state standards, but those are inquiry-driven units. And so they're really, really interesting, compelling questions that guide the unit. And so it's just a really good example of inquiry. Then there's, as Jane was talking about, EAD, there's educator resources, and the C3 teachers inquiry lessons. So again, more of that inquiry, but we teachers, borrowing is what we do, right? So I would say, yes, borrow away and then make it better, right? Because you're going to make what you're going to do is you're going to adapt it to your own community. You are the experts on your kids, on your community. You know what's going to be too controversial. You know what's going to be engaging to kids. So we just mentioned these to you as like ways in which you could take them and build upon them and, improve them and make them localized to your communities. Do we have any other questions?
I was just about to say, if there are no other questions, well, you obviously can reach out to Maggie, Anne-Lise, or myself at any point in time. I'll put up our email here in a minute, and feel free to email us for anything. And we'll send Martha a list of resources as we were mentioning. But one thing that we did want to ask you before we all leave for today is, what might you try on Monday? So knowing that this is Wednesday and we're being a little generous, we're not asking you for tomorrow, but like, what might be some things that you might actually try to do on Monday? You can share in the chat or unmute.
I guess in my times where I try to do some co-planning and co-teaching with, I support like 5 different grade levels, but is really talking with teachers about what their next units are in social studies. So I can see if there's ways that I can try to support some of their endeavors. And especially, I'm always trying to find resources ahead of time that some of my students that I support will be able to access. So it's got me thinking.
Great.
I love that, Cindy. It's so important to, align curricular integration is so important for, just like figuring out what people are teaching and how can different adults teaching in different, whatever their subject areas, collaborate and reference in other classes. I love that. I love the survey idea too. Student teaching, yay. Oh, good. It's so exciting thinking about that. We're so glad you're becoming a teacher. Fabulous.
Like Chris, I was fascinated with the Project Place work. That was just really, that was amazing to see that. And the Journey Box idea, I'm curious about that as well. So, well, thank you.
I was just about to say, I'm sorry for putting like teachers on the spot at the end of a day in the middle of the week. But just as a last note, thank you all so much. And here is our email address, and I'm putting them in the link in case that's easier for you to copy and paste over. But as I mentioned, feel free to email any of us, all of us, if you have any questions or follow-up.
Thank you so very much for your time and for putting this together, all these really rich resources. I look forward to receiving a couple of other things, and then Amanda Pollock and I will send a recording of this out, and also the addition, all the resources that we can gather from this, which are considerable. I think I have a long list here. So thank you. Are there any questions about the professional development hours? Does everyone understand that piece of this?
I actually don't know how that works. This is the first PD thing I've done. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. Some teachers, I'm not sure if you, I'm not sure, you're a student, right, Mackenzie? So I'm not sure if it would be necessary. But once you start teaching and you're certified, then you're going to want to keep track of the number of professional hours that you have had for training for professional development, and you'll need to collect the certificates. So anyway, that's what I'm offering. I don't know that you need it as a graduate student, unless you just want it, just to show that you did it, and you could submit it to a professor or something and show that that you're pursuing this on your own. So I'm happy to do that. I also can put my email in, and what I ask people to do, because I kind of do it, I either do it now or I do it later if people are going to be submitting curricula to me. So what you could do is just let me know, like, I'd like the 2 hours now, and here's my mailing address. Or I'll get something to you by May 1st, and I'm going to go for the 8 hours, and I'm going to go for the stipend. So if you could just, let me know that. And if you could also please fill out it's a very long link, and I apologize for that, but the evaluation survey, it's very quick. It's just like 3 questions, like what was great, what could have been better, that kind of thing, just so we can get feedback from you. But this is my email. and the program manager or I will get back to you with the professional development certificate and or in whatever form you want to do it. Any other questions? No, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. I'm wondering if I could talk to the presenters just for a couple minutes after everyone leaves. Is that okay? All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Amazing participation. I loved it.
Yes.